put yourself, just for a moment, in a very specific, profoundly terrifying place.
Okay, I'm ready.
Imagine standing on the slanted, freezing deck of a ship in the absolute pitch-black darkness of the Southern Ocean at midnight. And when I say pitch black, I am not talking about the dark of your bedroom when you turn off the lamp.
Right, right.
I mean a complete sensory void, like a darkness so heavy and total that it literally feels like physical pressure against your eyes. You are surrounded by shrieking gale force winds tearing across the water.
Winds so violently loud that if someone were standing right shoulder to shoulder with you, screaming at the absolute top of their lungs, you wouldn't hear a single syllable.
Exactly. The ambient temperature is plunging well below freezing, and crashing against the creaking iron hull beneath your feet are these rogue waves the size of 4-story office buildings.
It is an environment that is fundamentally, violently hostile to human life. I mean, once you sail past that final side of land, once you cross down into that icy abyss near the Antarctic Circle, you are entirely stripped of your dominance over nature.
Yeah, you really are.
Out there, you are at the mercy of a world that just does not care about your cutting-edge technology or, your decades of maritime experience or your personal courage, for that matter.
Right. The ocean doesn't care.
No, it's a place with the raw, terrifying power to just erase you completely without leaving so much as a splinter or a ripple behind to prove you ever even existed.
And that is the daily lived reality of the Deep South. So today we are taking a deep dive into what actually happens when human hubris, driven by industrial capitalism, meets those darkest, deadliest waters on Earth.
It's a fascinating and, frankly, terrifying topic.
It really is. Today, we're bypassing the campfire ghost stories. We are taking the raw, unvarnished shipping logs, the Lloyd's of London registry data, the naval inquiry reports, and, newspaper archives from 1890.
We're really getting into the weeds on this one.
Oh, absolutely. We are boarding a legendary ship called the Marlborough.
Ah, the Marlborough. She was a massive iron-built, 2-decked merchant sailing marvel of the Victorian era.
A total beast of a ship.
Exactly. And in January of 1890, this state-of-the-art vessel, carrying a highly valuable cargo and 30 human souls, sailed out into the freezing expanse between New Zealand and Cape Horn. And she simply vanished.
Swallowed whole by the ocean, like gone. And our mission today is to strip away over a century of maritime folklore, the sensational clickbait headlines from the 1910s, and the tangled web of fake survivor accounts.
There are so many of those.
So many. We want to reconstruct the unvarnished reality of what actually occurred out there in the ice, because the truth of the Marlborough's fate and the systemic nightmare it unleashed on the maritime community is so much darker than any myth.
It truly is. But to understand the sheer scale of this tragedy and why it shook the very foundations of the global shipping industry, we really have to start by understanding the machine herself.
Right. We need to set the scene.
The Marlborough wasn't some fragile, rickety wooden raft taking a desperate one-off gamble across the ocean. When she was launched in June of 1876, built by the highly respected firm of Robert Duncan and Company in Scotland, she was the absolute pinnacle of naval engineering.
She was basically the pride of the fleet.
Exactly.
Let's unpack the physical scale of this ship for a second, because I think it's really easy for us today to hear 1800s sailing ship and picture something small, right? Like a little pirate ship from a movie.
Oh, sure. Yep.
But the Duncan shipyards were building Leviathans. I mean, the Marlborough was 228 feet long. She had a beam, which is the width at her widest point of 35 feet.
And a draft of over 21 feet, meaning 21 feet of her hull sat below the waterline when she was fully loaded.
Right. She was an iron-hulled, 3-masted, full-rigged Titan. If you want a modern equivalent for what this meant to the shipping industry in 1890, think of a top-of-the-line commercial jetliner today, like a Boeing 747 or an Airbus A380.
That's a perfect analogy, actually, because transitioning from wooden hulls to iron hulls allowed shipbuilders to create much larger, vastly stronger vessels.
Because wood has structural limits.
Exactly. If you make a wooden ship too long, the waves will actually cause the hull to bend. It's a phenomenon called hogging and sagging. Iron eliminated that entirely. It allowed for these massive, rigid cargo holds.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So the Marlborough was essentially a heavily funded, technologically advanced industrial machine operating on a routine, highly profitable route. When a ship of this pedigree vanishes, it's exactly like a 747 just evaporating from air traffic control radar mid-flight.
It doesn't just cause grief, it causes absolute systemic panic.
Exactly.
And her track record leading up to 1890 was completely impeccable. Under her first commander, Captain Anderson, she made numerous voyages between London and New Zealand, and she was famous for being incredibly fast.
Very fast, yeah.
On one specific occasion in 1880, she traveled from Littleton in New Zealand to Cornwall in just 71 days. I mean, we're talking about a ship powered entirely by wind traversing the globe in just over 2 months.
That is just staggering speed for the era.
Right. She successfully transported thousands of immigrants to New Zealand over 14 voyages. She was a proven, durable survivor of the world's worst oceans.
But what made her truly valuable in 1890 wasn't just her speed or her iron hull. It was what she was carrying and how she was carrying it.
The cargo.
The cargo.
Right.
The shipping records show that the Marlborough was converted very early in her career to carry mechanical refrigeration. And we really need to understand how revolutionary this was at the time.
Yeah, because she was transporting massive cargoes of frozen meat and wool from New Zealand back to the booming population of London.
Exactly.
Okay, wait, I want to pause here because this absolutely blows my mind. When I think of 1890, I do not think of mechanical freezers. I think of, like, salting meat or maybe packing it in sawdust and river ice.
Right, the traditional preservation methods.
Yeah. How exactly did shipboard refrigeration work on a wind-powered vessel in the 1880s?
It was honestly a thermodynamic miracle of the Victorian age. They generally used a system called a Bell-Coleman cycle machine, or something very similar to it.
Okay.
They had a steam engine on board, but not to propel the ship, to run a massive air compressor. This machine took ambient air and compressed it heavily. Now, the laws of thermodynamics dictate that when you compress a gas, it gets extremely hot.
Oh, right, of course.
So they would take this highly pressurized piping hot air and run it through a series of pipes that were constantly cooled by ocean water, which was pumped from outside the ship.
So they're cooling the compressed air back down to the temperature of the seawater.
Exactly. And then comes the magic part. They take that compressed, cooled air, and they allow it to rapidly expand into the heavily insulated cargo hold.
And expansion cools it down.
Precipitously. When a gas expands, its temperature drops drastically. This rapid expansion dropped the air temperature in the hold well below freezing.
That is wild.
So they could load thousands of slaughtered sheep in New Zealand, keep them rock-solid frozen while sailing right through the blazing heat of the tropics, and deliver them perfectly fresh to the meat markets in London.
That is just brilliant engineering. It's basically the Victorian equivalent of the Silicon Valley tech boom. Suddenly, you have solved the geographic food crisis.
You really have.
You can feed the exploding, industrialized population of London with meat raised on the vast, open pastures on the literal opposite side of the planet. So the Marlborough isn't just a ship. She is a highly valuable floating industrial freezer carrying incredibly lucrative cargo.
Which brings us to her final departure. It is January 11th, 1890. The ship is now under the command of Captain Hurd, a highly experienced veteran seaman.
Okay.
They are departing Littleton, New Zealand. On board are 29 professional crewmen and a single female passenger, a Mrs. W.B. Anderson. They are fully loaded to the brim with frozen mutton and wool.
A full house and a full hold.
Everything is perfect. The cargo is stowed, the ship is in good trim, the crew is seasoned, and the refrigeration machinery is humming. Every single indicator points to a routine, immensely profitable voyage back to England.
But then, just 2 days later, on January 13th, she is spotted out on the open ocean. She is spoken to, which in 19th century maritime terms means they basically exchanged signal flags or a brief shouted greeting across the waves.
Right, a routine check-in between ships.
Exactly. This was done by Captain Gordon of a passing bark called the Falkland Hill. They see the Marlborough slicing through the water, looking absolutely magnificent, fully rigged and catching the wind, and that is it.
That's the end of the story.
That brief exchange of pleasantries across the rolling gray waves is the very last time the Marlborough or the 30 human beings aboard her were ever seen by human eyes. After that moment, the ocean just swallowed them.
It is a profoundly chilling thought. I mean, one moment you are a fully functioning, bustling micro-society of 30 people living aboard this iron island. You're making jokes, working the rigging, eating meals.
And the next moment, you are literally a ghost story.
Exactly. But before we follow the Marlborough down into the dark, I want to pull out a specific detail from the Maritime Archives that I think highlights the unbearable human element of this historical event.
Oh, please do.
We need to talk about a young man named Alex Carson.
Yes, this detail is incredible. Let's look at the sheer biological luck of Alex Carson.
Alex Carson was a young ship's apprentice. He was assigned to the Marlborough. He had his sea chest packed. He was manifested on the crew list. And he was completely 100% ready to sail on that final January 11th voyage.
But he didn't.
No, just days, perhaps even mere hours before the ship slipped its moorings, Carson fell severely ill. We don't have the exact medical diagnosis, perhaps a severe influenza, a spiking fever, or a respiratory infection, but he was entirely incapacitated.
He physically couldn't do the job.
Right, he was too sick to work the rigging. So Captain Heard makes the practical decision to leave him behind in New Zealand to recover in a hospital, and the Marlborough sails without him.
A random fever. A biological coin flip. That microscopic virus is literally the only thing that stood between this young man and the freezing abyss.
Think about the crushing psychological weight of that for the rest of his life. The profound, inescapable survivor's guilt.
Oh, it must have been agonizing.
Months later, when the ship is officially posted as missing at Lloyd's of London, when the families of those 29 crewmen are plunging into deep mourning, Alex Carson is sitting there, breathing, living his life.
Knowing that he was supposed to be with them.
Knowing with absolute terrifying certainty that if he hadn't caught that random bug, his bones would be resting at the bottom of the ocean. It really highlights the sheer terrifying fragility of life out there.
One tiny twist of fate, one sneeze, is the literal difference between living to old age and vanishing into the freezing void.
It's haunting.
It really forces you to reframe the narrative. When we casually talk about a ship disappearing, we aren't talking about a piece of wood and iron sinking. We're talking about 30 individual universes, 30 futures, 30 families, just erased from the timeline in an instant.
Yes, exactly.
So we have to ask what actually happened. Because the ship vanished perfectly. There was no wreckage washed up on a beach. There were no distress signals. I mean, they obviously didn't have radio back then to SOS.
No, none of that.
To find the answer, we have to look at the environmental reality of the ocean they sailed into.
Precisely. And to do that, we need to understand the mechanics of their route. Captain Heard, like many highly ambitious captains of the Clipper era, utilized a navigational strategy called Great Circle navigation.
Okay, I've heard this term in the records. Can you break down exactly how this works? Because looking at a standard flat world map, sailing extremely far south toward Antarctica to get from New Zealand to South America looks like a massive, incredibly dangerous detour.
It does look like that, yeah.
Why do it?
Oh, it's all about geometry and atmospheric physics. Because the Earth is a sphere, the shortest distance between 2 points isn't a straight line drawn on a flat Mercator projection map. It's an arc that curves toward the poles.
Okay, makes sense.
If you stretch a string between New Zealand and Cape Horn on a globe, the string curves deeply south. But it's not just about distance, it's about wind. Down in the extreme southern latitudes, there are no land masses to break up the air currents.
So the wind just whips around the Earth.
Exactly. The wind just endlessly circles the globe, building up terrifying momentum. These are the westerlies. Mariners called them the Roaring 40s, the Furious 50s, and the Screaming 60s.
The Screaming 60s, that just sounds like a nightmare.
To cut massive amounts of time off the voyage, captains would sail incredibly far south to catch these relentless gale-force tailwinds and literally surf their massive iron ships toward Cape Horn.
Surf them? Wow. But the records indicate that Captain Heard was particularly aggressive with this strategy, right? He was known for running his ships down to 68 degrees south.
He was, yes.
Just for context for you listening, 68 degrees south isn't just near Antarctica. That latitude is actually inside the Antarctic Circle.
He is taking a massive, rigid, iron-hulled sailing ship into one of the most dangerous, unpredictable, and lethal maritime environments on the entire planet.
It's just so risky.
And we know, based on contemporaneous ship logs, exactly what was waiting for them down there. The records show that in early to mid-February of 1890, which is the exact chronological window when the Marlborough would have been passing through the zone between the Chatham Islands and Cape Horn, another massive ship sailed through that same vicinity.
The RMS Rimutaka.
Yes, the Rimutaka. And the captain of the Rimutaka officially reported encountering great quantities of ice.
Right, not a few stray ice cubes. A literal graveyard of icebergs blocking the route.
And we need to be clear about what an Antarctic iceberg actually is. We aren't talking about the jagged little peaks you see in the North Atlantic. We are talking about tabular icebergs that have calved directly off the Antarctic ice shelf.
Basically flat-topped mountains of ice.
Yes. These things are essentially floating islands of solid freshwater ice. They could be the size of small cities. They can rise hundreds of feet out of the water, which means, based on buoyancy physics, they extend hundreds, sometimes over 1,000 feet below the surface.
That is just unfathomable scale.
And significantly sized Antarctic icebergs had been consistently observed as far north as 50 degrees south in the Pacific Ocean. Cape Horn itself sits at 56 degrees south.
So they were deep in it.
The Marlborough, at 68 degrees south, was sailing right through the absolute thickest, most lethal part of the ice field.
But this brings up a massive question for me, and I want to push back on the logic of these Victorian captains for a second. If Captain Heard knew this route was packed with lethal, city-sized blocks of ice, and he was a veteran, he definitely knew the risks, why do it?
Great question.
I just don't buy that it was merely for the thrill. He is carrying highly valuable cargo, an expensive refrigeration plant, and 30 lives. Surely the insurance underwriters at Lloyd's of London would look at a captain steering an iron ship into the screaming 60s and say, your premiums are going to be astronomical. It's not worth it.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Why not just sail a few degrees further north, take an extra week, and ensure the multi-million-dollar asset gets home in one piece?
Well, it's a completely logical question from a modern perspective, but you really have to understand the ruthless, cutthroat nature of Victorian shipping economics.
The money over everything.
Always. The Marlborough was a commercial asset operating on tight margins. In that era, time was literally money, especially when you're burning coal to run a steam compressor just to keep the meat frozen.
Oh, I hadn't thought about the coal consumption for the freezers.
Exactly. The faster you made the passage, the faster the owners could sell the cargo, turn the ship around, and load up the next batch. Captains were judged, compensated, and sometimes even retained solely based on their passage times.
So there was immense pressure to be fast.
A captain who consistently brought his ship in fast was a star, highly sought after. A captain who took the safe, slow route might find his contract quietly terminated upon returning to London.
So it's not just personal hubris, it's a systemic failure.
Yeah.
The industry essentially financially incentivized captains to play Russian roulette with icebergs.
Exactly. They were so confident in these newly engineered iron ships, so arrogant about their mastery of thermodynamics and shipbuilding, that they began to treat the Southern Ocean as a mere obstacle to be smashed through, rather than an apocalyptic source of nature to be respected.
Man versus nature. And nature usually wins.
They roll the dice to satisfy the markets in London, and most of the time, to be fair, they won. They got through.
Yeah.
But the unforgiving law of averages dictates that if you keep rolling the dice in the pitch black of the Antarctic Circle, eventually the ice is going to win.
Let's reconstruct what that loss actually looks like. Because they vanished without a trace, we have to rely on the consensus of maritime investigators of the era to imagine those final minutes.
It's a horrifying scenario to picture.
Think about driving a massive semi-truck down a curving mountain highway in the dead of night, but your windshield is painted entirely black, and you are steering solely by the sound of other cars crashing around you. That is basically what navigating an ice field in 1890 was like.
They do not have sonar. They do not have radar.
No satellite imaging.
They have a magnetic compass, the stars, if they can even see them through the heavy freezing cloud cover, and the fragile human eyes of the lookout at the bow.
Just a guy peering into the dark.
Right. It is likely the middle of the night, or if it's daytime, the freezing fog is so incredibly thick that visibility is effectively zero. The ship is hurtling forward, driven by those furious tailwinds.
The sea spray is instantly freezing onto the rigging, making the ropes stiff as iron and completely useless.
And the acoustics alone would be psychological torture. The sound of a rigid iron ship navigating through loose pack ice, the grinding scrape of ice against the hull plates.
The booming, echoing cracks of glaciers shifting in the dark around them. The crew would have been on high alert, staring desperately into the blackness, frost literally forming on their eyelashes.
And then the physics of Victorian iron comes into play. And this is crucial. The wrought iron used in 1870s shipbuilding had a high ductile to brittle transition temperature.
What does that mean in plain English?
It means that when the ambient water temperature drops to near freezing, the iron hull stops being flexible and becomes incredibly brittle, almost like glass.
Wow. So the lookout screams. Suddenly, the darkness ahead solidifies. It's not fog. It's a towering, pale monolith of solid ice emerging just yards off the bow.
Too close. Way too close.
The helmsman at the wheel spins it frantically, desperately trying to turn thousands of tons of rigid iron and frozen sheet against the immense momentum of a gale-force wind.
But a heavily laden iron ship does not turn on a dime. They are far too close. The impact wouldn't just be a dull thud. It would be a catastrophic, deafening collision.
Because the hull is brittle from the freezing water, right? It doesn't just dent or buckle.
It shatters. The iron plates tear open along the rivet lines.
Just the sheer violence of that moment, the immediate chaotic rush of freezing, black water flooding into the lower decks. The ship lists violently to the side.
Down in the dark, the 29 crewmen and Mrs. Anderson are violently thrown from their bunks. The icy water is rising in a matter of seconds.
There is absolutely no time to organize an evacuation, and even if they could somehow lower a wooden lifeboat into those massive swells surrounded by grinding ice, it wouldn't be a rescue, it would just be a smaller, slower coffin.
And the most terrifying part is the psychological realization that must have set in during those final 30 or 40 seconds as the ship goes down.
The absolute certainty that no one is coming.
Exactly. They are thousands of miles from any shipping lane or port. No one on Earth even knows they are in trouble. They are entirely, profoundly alone as the freezing ocean pours into the hull, pulling the pride of the Victorian fleet down into the black void.
And then just silence. The ocean simply rolls over the spot, the winds keep howling, and they are erased as if they had never existed.
It makes your stomach drop just visualizing the claustrophobia and the isolation of it.
It really does. And if the sudden loss of the Marlborough wasn't terrifying enough, the dread in this historical narrative compounds almost immediately. Because the ocean wasn't done taking its toll on this specific industry.
No, it wasn't just an isolated tragedy.
Right. A terrifying contagion was spreading across the shipping lines.
This is where the story shifts from a single tragic accident to a systemic nightmare that gripped London. Let's look at the Marlborough's fleetmate, her sister ship in the frozen meat trade, a vessel called the Dundon.
Ah, the Dundon. She was incredibly famous in her own right. I mean, she was the very ship that had originally proven the viability of the refrigeration venture before the Marlborough was even converted.
Yes, she was a pioneer. She was equally celebrated, equally well-built, and equally valuable.
Okay.
And on March 19th, 1890, just 2 months after the Marlborough vanished, while the families and shipping executives back in London are just starting to really panic about the Marlborough being overdue, the Dundon sets sail from New Zealand.
Let me guess.
She is bound for London. She is taking the exact same Great Circle route, loaded with the exact same cargo of frozen meat.
And she, too, vanishes without a single solitary trace.
2 cutting-edge, massive iron ships, both carrying revolutionary refrigeration technology, both on the same route, both disappearing completely within weeks of each other.
Think about what that does to the psyche of the maritime community. Imagine you are an underwriter at Lloyd's of London. By the way, how exactly did that work? How did London officially process the reality that a ship was just gone?
Well, Lloyd's of London was essentially the nerve center of global maritime insurance. It wasn't a single company, but a market of individual underwriters who took on the financial risk of these voyages.
Like a stock exchange for ship risks.
Basically. When a ship was significantly overdue, anxiety would start building on the trading floor. Eventually, if weeks turned into months with no telegraphs from any ports and no passing ships reporting a sighting, the ship would be posted on the overdue board.
And that's when the panic sets in.
Exactly. The insurance premiums to reinsure the vessel would skyrocket. Finally, the committee at Lloyd's would make the grim decision to declare the ship officially missing.
They ring a bell or something, right?
They would ring the lutein bell. It was a salvage bell from an old shipwreck that hung right in the underwriting room. One ring meant bad news. The ship was officially considered lost with all hands, and the massive insurance payouts would begin.
So the lutein bell rings for the Marlborough. And then, shockingly soon after, it rings again for the Dunedin. The pattern recognition here is just terrifying.
You're sitting in those offices realizing your state-of-the-art ships aren't just having isolated accidents. They are being systematically swallowed by something massive in the Southern Ocean.
It creates a sense of absolute paralyzing dread across the industry. I mean, the questions start swirling wildly. Was there a colossal unrecorded superstorm that year that wiped that section of the ocean clean?
Was there a massive seismic event like a tsunami?
Or, what many experts found more likely, was a massive Antarctic ice shelf actively breaking apart, creating a literal wall of death. A floating blockade of ice hundreds of miles wide across the shipping lane that neither ship could possibly maneuver around.
Imagine being a young sailor assigned to the next ship, scheduled to run that exact route. Yeah. The absolute stomach-churning terror of walking up the gangplank in New Zealand, knowing that the last 60 people who did exactly what you were doing simply ceased to exist in the dark.
That would be a hard pass for me. And we have to consider the families left behind in London and Scotland, the agonizing lack of closure.
It's the not knowing that destroys you.
Exactly. When a ship sinks near the coast, wreckage eventually washes up. Life rings, cargo, bodies are recovered. There is a naval inquiry, there is a funeral, there is a physical grave to visit.
You get a period at the end of the sentence.
Right. But when a ship vanishes in the deep ocean, the families are trapped in a terrible psychological limbo. They are forced to live with the agonizing possibility that maybe, just maybe, the ship didn't sink.
Maybe it wrecked on a remote island. Maybe their husbands and sons survived.
And as we see in the historical archives, that desperate, lingering hope is sometimes far crueler than the certainty of death.
This brings us to a genuinely dark chapter of the story. Because death by a sudden, violent sinking is terrifying, yes, but it's relatively quick.
Surviving a sinking only to be stranded at the literal edge of the habitable world is a completely different kind of slow psychological horror. Let's jump forward in the timeline. It's now mid-1891.
Okay.
The Marlborough has been missing for a year and a half. The widows are wearing black. The life insurance has likely been paid out.
Right. Everyone assumes they're gone. And then a Canadian sealing schooner named the Maud S., commanded by a Captain McKeel, arrives in port in Victoria, British Columbia.
And they bring news.
And the crew brings with them a deeply disturbing rumor from the Deep South. They claim that in January of 1891, while operating in the extreme southern latitudes, they visually encountered a group of men near a place called Good Success Bay, down in Tierra del Fuego.
Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire. The very southernmost tip of South America, right where the Atlantic violently meets the Pacific at Cape Horn.
And the crew of the Maud S claims that these men they saw on the beach were shipwrecked British sailors. And even more bizarrely, they claimed these British sailors had been impressed into service, essentially forced into hard labor by the Argentine government at a remote life-saving station in Good Success Bay.
The moment this rumor hits the telegraph wires and makes it to the newspapers, specifically blowing up in the Daily Colonist in April 1891, it explodes across the British Empire.
The public mind immediately jumps to the missing refrigerated ships.
Right. Could this be the crew of the Marlborough? Or the Demidden? Are they alive down there, being held against their will?
The British government, facing immense public pressure, takes it seriously enough to mount a military response. They send the Royal Navy. They dispatch HMS Garnet, an Emerald-class corvette under the command of Captain Harry Francis Hughes Hallett.
Just to go check on a rumor?
Yes, to sail all the way down to Tierra del Fuego and thoroughly search Good Success Bay and the surrounding jagged coastal wilderness.
Just the logistics of that are wild. They send a heavily armed warship all the way down to the bottom of the world to search in an unmapped, hostile coastline based on a rumor from a Canadian seal hunter. And what do they find when they scour the bay?
Absolutely nothing.
Nothing at all.
No shipwrecked British sailors, no wreckage of an iron ship, no clandestine Argentine life-saving station holding captives, no trace that these men ever existed. The entire rumor was a phantom, likely a massive misunderstanding by the sealers or a deliberate tall tale spun in a port tavern.
This is exactly what I mean about the sheer cruelty of false hope. Put yourself in the shoes of Mrs. Anderson's family, or the mother of one of the young crewmen. For a year and a half, you've gone through the agonizing process of grieving. You've accepted that the sea took them.
You were trying to move on with your life.
And then a newspaper headline screams across London. Missing sailors found alive in South America. Your heart leaps into your throat. You start praying again. You start looking at maps, calculating how long it will take a Navy ship to bring them home.
Only to have the rug pulled out again.
Months later, the Navy comes back and says, sorry, it was just a story. They're still gone. The emotional whiplash of that is just devastating. It's a form of psychological torture.
And we have to objectively analyze the reality of the rumor. Even if we entertain the idea for a moment, if by some absolute miracle, a handful of crew members from the Marlborough had managed to launch a wooden lifeboat in the middle of a freezing night while their ship shattered against an iceberg,
Which is highly unlikely.
and if they had somehow navigated hundreds of miles of the deadliest ocean currents on Earth to wash up on the shores of Tierra del Fuego, their fate would have been agonizing.
Wait, but Tierra del Fuego isn't a frozen, sterile ice cap year-round, right? I mean, if they made it to shore, wouldn't they have a fighting chance? There's land, there's a coast. Couldn't they build a fire, hunt, survive like castaways?
It is absolutely not a tropical island, nor is it a forgiving temperate forest. Tierra del Fuego has an incredibly desolate subpolar oceanic climate. It is battered by near-constant freezing rain and howling gale-force winds.
So cold and wet constantly.
Yes. The terrain is characterized by rugged, impenetrable coastal mountains, sheer cliffs, and dense, dripping, sodden forests, where starting a fire is nearly impossible. The waters are freezing.
What about the locals?
The indigenous populations at the time, who had been brutally mistreated by European explorers for decades, were understandably highly hostile to outsiders. If you stagger out of the freezing surf onto that rocky beach, starving, suffering from hypothermia, with no shelter, no dry clothes, and no survival supplies, you haven't been saved.
You've just delayed the inevitable.
You've just delayed your death by a few days and made it infinitely more physically painful. The fight for survival against those elements would be a slow, freezing descent into absolute despair.
So, in a deeply twisted way, the sudden, violent sinking in the ice is almost a mercy compared to the prolonged reality of surviving a wreck in Tierra del Fuego.
It really is.
But the rumors of castaways didn't stop with the Maud S in 1891. And this is where the historical deep dive gets really intricate and, frankly, incredibly dark. Because decades later, another eyewitness account surfaces that seemingly confirmed the absolute worst fears of those grieving families.
Ah, yes, the Burley account.
Right, but when we unpack the details, it reveals a historical twist that is somehow even more tragic than the legend of the Marlborough itself.
We are talking about the account of Captain Thomas Sidney Burley. His story starts circulating in maritime circles in England around 1912. It gets published in New Zealand papers in 1913 and is detailed much more extensively in later historical retrospectives around 1940.
Let's lay out Burley's claim exactly as he told it. He says that he was a crew member on a sailing bark called the Cordova. He claims that in July of 1890, the Cordova was shipwrecked off the jagged coast of Tierra del Fuego.
Oh.
He and a few desperate survivors are wandering this desolate coastal wasteland, fighting hypothermia, trying to reach the area of Good Success Bay in hopes of finding rescue. And as they are trekking through this freezing environment, they stumble upon a horrific scene.
Burley claims they found a ship's wooden lifeboat pulled up high on the shingle, well above the high tide mark, and clearly painted on the side of the boat were the words Marlborough of London.
A lifeboat from the missing refrigerated ship.
That is the direct implication.
Oh.
But the scene he describes gets so much worse. Nearby, nestled against the rocks, they find a pathetic makeshift shelter, a tent, fashioned out of old rotting sail canvas.
Oh no.
And inside and immediately around that collapsed tent, they find a massive pile of scavenged mussel shells and the bleached skeletons of 7 human beings.
7 human skeletons. The clear, horrifying narrative being that 7 men from the Marlborough survived the terrifying ice collision, sailed a tiny, open wooden boat hundreds of miles to Tierra del Fuego, dragged it up the rocky beach, built a desperate tent, and slowly, agonizingly starved or froze to death eating raw mussels while staring out at the empty ocean.
It's the ultimate nightmare scenario we just talked about, seemingly confirmed by a direct eyewitness.
It is an incredibly visceral, chilling image. But here is where rigorous historical analysis and cross-referencing of the source material becomes absolutely crucial.
Yes, the facts tell a different story.
Because when investigators look closely at the timeline Burley provided, the entire narrative collapses. Burley claimed the Cordova was wrecked in July of 1890, but official maritime registry records prove definitively that the Cordova actually sank in July of 1888.
Wait a second. July 1888. That is a full year and a half before the Marlborough even loaded her frozen meat in New Zealand.
Exactly. The historical record shows the surviving crew of the Cordova was rescued in September of 1888. Therefore, Burley couldn't possibly have found a lifeboat from the 1890 Marlborough because Marlborough hadn't even vanished yet. She was safely running routes for another 18 months.
So what is happening here? Is Burley just a complete fraud? Is he fabricating a macabre story decades later just to get his name in the papers and capitalize on the famous mystery of the Marlborough?
Not necessarily. This is where the psychology of memory and trauma comes into play. It's something akin to the memory malleability studies done by modern psychologists. Burley's detailed, formalized account wasn't published until decades after the events, some versions appearing 24 years later, others nearly 50 years later.
Memory is notoriously unreliable over that kind of time.
Right. When a human being endures a severe trauma like a freezing shipwreck and then decades pass, human memory degrades and reconstructs itself. It conflates dates, it retroactively absorbs information it heard later, and weaves it seamlessly into the original memory.
So he might have been telling his subjective truth.
It is highly probable that Burley really was wrecked on the Cordova in 1888, and he really did find a horrific scene of a canvas tent and skeletons on a beach. But the name Marlborough might have been a detail his brain erroneously pasted over the memory years later, simply because the Marlborough's disappearance became the most famous maritime mystery of the era.
But the historical records point to an incredible twist here, an absolute aha moment that explains the boat perfectly without Burley having to be a liar or crazy.
Oh, this is the craziest part.
If he saw a boat that genuinely had the word Marlborough painted on it, and it absolutely wasn't our 1890 frozen meat ship whose skeletons were sitting in that tent,
Right, who were they?
they almost certainly belonged to the crew of a German sailing bark called the Iquique.
The Iquique?
Yes, the Iquique went missing near Cape Horn in June of 1883 with 30 men on board. And here is the profound historical twist. Before being sold to a German shipping company in 1882 and renamed, the Iquique had originally been built in 1862 under a different name.
Oh my God.
Her original christened name was the Marlborough.
That is just wow.
Yes. So the dilapidated lifeboat Burley stumbled across in 1888 likely was marked Marlborough, because lifeboats are expensive and often aren't repainted or replaced when a ship changes hands. It was an older lifeboat from the 1883 wreck of the Iquique.
It's like finding a message in a bottle from a ghost, only to realize it's from a completely different ghost. The British public in 1913 was so incredibly desperate for answers about the missing 1890 Marlborough, so eager to solve the mystery and find closure, that they accidentally unearthed the forgotten graveyard of a completely different, tragic ship that just happened to share its name.
And if you stop for a moment and think about the factual, verified tragedy of that Iquique crew, it's profoundly disturbing. 7 men from that 1883 wreck survived whatever violent catastrophe sank their ship.
They actually made it to land.
They fought the freezing surf, dragging a heavy wooden boat onto a rocky, desolate beach in Tierra del Fuego. They built a desperate little canvas tent to block the howling, freezing wind. They scoured the tide pools for mussels, doing everything in their human power to stay alive.
And they waited.
They waited. And they died, one by one, of exposure, hypothermia, and starvation. And the deeply tragic irony of their suffering is that they were holding out hope for a rescue party, but the Argentine government didn't even establish a settlement or a presence at Good Success Bay until late 1887.
4 years later.
4 full years after the Iquique went missing, nobody was coming for them. Nobody even knew where to look. They died utterly alone on the absolute edge of the earth, and their bones just sat there in the freezing wind until Burley stumbled across them 5 years later.
The layers of tragedy in this region are just staggering. It's a literal layered graveyard of ships down there. And I think it perfectly highlights how, when reality offers no closure, when the deep ocean simply refuses to give up its dead, the human mind desperately struggles to cope.
We fundamentally hate ambiguity.
We do. The idea that a massive, state-of-the-art machine and 30 people can just cease to exist is too terrifying, too chaotic of an idea to accept. So what do? We create a narrative to fill the void. We invent a story that gives us an ending, even if it's a horrifying one.
Which brings us to the most famous, the most chilling, and the most completely fabricated part of the Marlborough story. The legend of the ghost ship in the Cape.
Yes. The specific story that everyone who Googles this ship knows. The one that turned a genuine historical tragedy into a cheap maritime myth. Let's look at exactly how this legend was born and weaponized by the media.
It's a classic case of sensationalism.
It's October 1913. 23 years have passed since the Marlborough sailed into the ice. The grieving families have mostly passed on, or they have long since accepted the loss. The world has moved on. And then, a newspaper in Singapore, the Straits Times, republishes a highly sensational story that had just run in London's Evening Standard.
The newspaper boldly claims they have received an unverified, highly dramatic account, cabled all the way from New Zealand, stating that a sailing ship called the Johnson had just discovered the missing Marlborough.
23 years later. And the imagery used in this newspaper report is straight out of a gothic, penny, dreadful horror novel. I'm going to paraphrase a bit of how it was described because it is so vivid.
Please do.
The captain of this ship, the Johnson, claims they were sailing off the rocky coves near Punta Arenas in Chile. It's evening, the sun is setting blood red, and the stillness of the air is uncanny. They round a jagged, rocky point into a deep, silent, shadowed cove, and there she is, the Marlborough.
Oh, she's not just sitting there intact. The report goes into lavish, macabre detail. It describes her tall masts and rigging as being completely coated in green. The literal quote is, "the green of decay."
So creepy.
A vessel sitting perfectly still as if in a cradle, seemingly untouched by the violence of the ocean, but completely covered in thick mold and moss.
The crew of the Johnson supposedly lowers a boat and boards this ghost ship. The wooden decks are rotting and cracking under their heavy boots. And then they find the crew, 20 skeletons scattered across the ship.
They even map out where they found them.
Exactly. The report specifies the dramatic locations. 3 skeletons huddled in the hatchway, 10 skeletons sitting in the mess room, 1 skeleton lying right beneath the ship's wheel, and 6 others, including supposedly the captain, on the bridge. They even claim to find a rusty cutlass and moldy, unreadable books in the captain's cabin.
It is an incredibly evocative cinematic image, a massive ghost ship floating silently in a hidden cove for 2.5 decades. Her skeletal crew still faithfully at their stations. It captured the public imagination instantly. The story spread globally, republished in dozens of languages.
And like all great urban legends, over the years, it mutated. In 1929, another version claimed a ship called the British Isles found the Marlborough in 1899. As recently as 2006, an author named Tom Quinn published a book claiming a Royal Navy vessel found it. The myth simply refuses to die because it's such a compelling image.
But we're here to deep dive into the historical facts. And as cinematic and spooky as this story is, we need to bring the hammer down on it. It's time to completely dismantle this 1913 clickbait.
Let's do it, methodically.
From an oceanographic and maritime engineering perspective, the entire story is laughably impossible. First, let's look at the actual environment of Cape Horn and the Drake Passage. The idea that a derelict, unsteered iron ship could drift aimlessly around the Horn for 23 years without sinking is absurd.
Right, because of the currents.
That specific area is defined by the Antarctic Circumpolar Current. It is the most massive, violent ocean current on Earth, moving endlessly eastward without any landmass to slow it down. Combined with hurricane-force winds and dense iceberg fields, an unsteered vessel would be driven onto the jagged rocks of the South American coast and smashed into iron confetti or crushed by an iceberg within a matter of weeks, if not days.
It absolutely wouldn't gently float into a quiet cove and just sit there undisturbed for 2 decades.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the location itself? They claim to find it hiding near Punta Arenas.
Punta Arenas in the 1890s and early 1900s was not some uncharted, forgotten, misty wilderness. It was a highly bustling cosmopolitan settlement. There was an active minor gold rush happening in the region.
Lots of people, lots of ships.
Yes, the Strait of Magellan was a major, heavily trafficked shipping lane for global commerce. The idea that a massive, green, skeleton-filled ghost ship could sit in a cove right near a major maritime hub and go completely unnoticed by thousands of prospectors, local fishermen, and the heavily armed navies that regularly patrolled the area looking for castaways is purely fictional.
All right, what about the hero of the story? The ship that supposedly found it, the Johnson.
This is where the paper trail completely and utterly evaporates. Maritime investigators have extensively scoured the port arrival and departure records for New Zealand and Chile during 1912 and 1913.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no record of any sailing ship named the Johnson arriving or departing. Furthermore, sailing ships coming from England to New Zealand wouldn't normally take the treacherous Cape Horn route anyway. The prevailing winds dictate they would sail east around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa.
So the Johnson wasn't even there.
The Johnson didn't just fail to report the finding to the authorities. The Johnson simply does not seem to have existed on that route at that time.
And the most damning piece of evidence, the absolute smoking gun that proves whoever wrote this was sitting at a desk in London and had no idea what they were talking about.
The newspaper report specifically dramatically mentions finding 6 skeletons on the bridge.
Right.
The Marlborough was an 1876 full-rigged sailing ship. She was steered from an exposed wheel at the stern. She did not have a bridge.
Exactly. It's like writing a terrifying story about a haunted 1960s Mustang and saying the ghosts were sitting in the back seat staring at the Apple CarPlay screen.
Right. The person who invented this story threw in a modern 20th century steamship naval term to make it sound dramatic and official, and in doing so, outed the entire article as pure fiction.
It's a complete fabrication. It is a penny dreadful horror story tastelessly pasted over a real-life, devastating tragedy.
But this raises a really fascinating psychological question. Think about how you'd react if you read that headline today. If this story is so easily debunked, if literally 5 minutes of checking Lloyd's shipping records and basic ship blueprints proves it's fake, why did it spread like wildfire across the globe in 1913?
People wanted to believe it.
Why did major newspapers print it? Why do we, as humans, want to believe in ghost ships? Why does a fake story about 20 rotting skeletons on a moss-covered deck feel somehow more satisfying to the public than the truth?
I think it comes down to our deep evolutionary need for narrative conclusion. The human mind is terrified of a void. When a massive ship simply vanishes into thin air, it implies that the world is chaotic, unpredictable, and vastly indifferent to our existence.
Pure existential dread.
It means you can do everything right. You can build a state-of-the-art iron ship, invent brilliant refrigeration technology, hire a veteran crew, and still just be randomly erased by a block of ice in the dark.
Yeah.
That is a deeply uncomfortable existential truth.
It reminds us we aren't in control.
Exactly. But a ghost ship. A ghost ship is a contained narrative. It's like an internet creepypasta. It has a defined beginning, a middle, and an end. The ship was lost, but then, crucially, it was found. We know where the bodies are. We know how the story concludes, even if the conclusion is macabre and spooky.
A definitive ending provides a strange sort of psychological comfort because it closes the cognitive loop.
It replaces the terrifying, infinite ambiguity of the ocean with a manageable fictional monster that we can point to and understand.
It's like we'd much rather deal with a haunted house than a black hole. We prefer the horror we can see, the green moss, the rusty cutlass, the skeletons, to the horror of absolute, silent, instantaneous erasure.
Precisely. We project our own need for order onto the silence of the ocean.
Let's synthesize this incredibly dark journey we've been on today. We started in the bustling, confident, heavily industrialized Victorian ports, looking at a proud, cutting-edge vessel.
The Marlborough was the absolute pinnacle of human engineering at the time, a symbol of our arrogant ability to conquer distance and temperature, carrying frozen meat across the globe to feed an expanding empire.
And we followed her descent. From that confident, profitable departure down into the great white void, we looked at the terrifying reality of what it actually meant to sail blind into a freezing, crushing labyrinth of ice at 68 degrees south, driven by the relentless pressure of capitalist shipping contracts.
We saw the contagion of disaster with the Demon vanishing weeks later, the cruel, agonizing false hopes of the Maud S rumors, and the deeply tragic reality of the Iquique skeletons. 7 men who fought for survival and died waiting for a rescue that would never ever come.
And finally, we stripped away the green moss, the clickbait headlines, and the fictional skeletons of the 1913 ghost ship myth. What we are left with is a historical reality that is far more profound and far more terrifying than any campfire tale.
The overarching theme of the Marlborough isn't ghosts, it's scale.
It's the staggering, incomprehensible power of the natural world and the sheer vulnerability of humanity when we let our hubris push us too far into the wild. We love to think our technology protects us, that our iron hulls and steam compressors make us invincible masters of the earth.
But the deep Southern Ocean doesn't care about iron. It doesn't care about commerce or insurance premiums or how fast you made the run last year.
It can erase a massive machine and 30 lives in a matter of minutes, and it won't even leave a ripple on the surface to mark the spot where you fought your final battle.
It's a profoundly humbling realization. The real-life horror of an iron ship shattering against an unseen iceberg in the pitch black, the deafening sound of the impact, the freezing water rushing in, the absolute crushing isolation of knowing you are thousands of miles from help, that is infinitely more terrifying to contemplate than a fictional ship drifting peacefully in a quiet Chilean cove.
It really is. As we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, deeply haunting scientific reality to mull over. Something that builds on everything we've discussed today about the physical environment of the deep ocean.
We've talked a lot about the violent mechanics of the sinking, the shattering of the iron, and the myth of the rotting ghost ship on the surface. But let's think about the actual physical reality of the deep Southern Ocean floor.
The waters down there, miles beneath the surface in the bathypelagic zone, are vast, crushing, and bitterly, intensely cold, hovering just above freezing.
And because it is so cold and under such immense crushing hydrostatic pressure, the deep water is largely oxygen deprived. It doesn't support the kind of rampant decay you see in the shallows. It acts as a near-perfect chemical preservative.
Wood-boring organisms, the shipworms and microbes that rapidly rot away wooden shipwrecks in warmer, shallower coastal waters, simply cannot survive down there in the freezing dark.
Which means, if the Marlborough and the Denunnan went down in those freezing abyssal depths after striking the ice, they aren't rotting away.
They didn't turn to dust.
They haven't been consumed by the sea. They are likely sitting incredibly intact at the absolute bottom of the world right now. The shattered iron hull, the massive steam compressors, the frozen cargo of New Zealand mutton, perhaps even the remains of the crew, locked away, frozen in time.
Completely silent, perfectly preserved in the pitch black under miles of water, sitting there right now as you listen to this, holding the exact, indisputable answers to what happened in their final terrifying moments. An answer we will likely never, ever reach.